Ethan Everly had long since learned to live in the shadow of his father's towering legacy. Charles Everly was a man of immense wealth and influence, a billionaire philanthropist adored by the public and feared in private circles. Ethan's relationship with him, however, was far from the polished image that Charles projected to the world. Their bond had fractured years ago, leaving Ethan estranged, resentful, and burdened by memories of a childhood marked by distance and neglect. Growing up, Ethan had watched his mother, Eleanor, struggle to maintain a sense of normalcy within the gilded cage of the Everly mansion. She was kind and warm, a stark contrast to Charles's cold demeanor and relentless ambition. Ethan remembered how she would tell bedtime stories, her soft voice weaving magic into the air, even as stress lines deepened around her eyes. Yet behind her smiles, there was always an undercurrent of sadness, one Ethan didn't fully understand until after her death. Eleanor had passed away when Ethan was in his early 20s, leaving him alone to navigate the turbulent dynamics of his family. Her death had been sudden, a heart attack that claimed her life too soon. In the aftermath, Charles had shown little emotion, focusing instead on public appearances and business ventures. Ethan had been left to grieve in silence, his pain exacerbated by the realization that his father seemed unbothered by the loss of his wife. That was the moment their already strained relationship had irreparably broken. Years later, Ethan found himself living a modest life far removed from the luxury of his upbringing. He worked as a freelance photographer, capturing the beauty of ordinary moments that he had once taken for granted. It was a career that brought him peace, even if it meant struggling to make ends meet. He had distanced himself from the Everly name, refusing to benefit from the wealth that he believed had poisoned his family. One evening, as Ethan sifted through old photographs of his mother, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. The sender was anonymous, and the message was cryptic. "The truth about your father's empire is hidden in plain sight. Look closer, and you'll find the answers you seek." Attached was a scanned document, a financial record bearing the Everly Foundation's logo. At first, Ethan dismissed it as a hoax, a ploy by someone trying to stir up trouble. But the more he stared at the document, the more something gnawed at him. The numbers didn't add up, and certain transactions were suspiciously large and unaccounted for. Curiosity soon gave way to a simmering anger. Ethan couldn't ignore the possibility that his father, the so-called paragon of virtue, might be hiding something sinister. Memories of his mother's struggles surfaced, and he wondered if there was a connection between her unhappiness and the contents of the message. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan decided to dig deeper, even if it meant reopening old wounds. He started by revisiting his mother's belongings, which he had kept stored in a small box in his apartment. Among her keepsakes were journals, filled with her neat handwriting. As Ethan flipped through the pages, he found entries that hinted at financial trouble she had faced during her marriage. There were mentions of legal disputes, vague references to betrayal, and a recurring phrase that caught his attention: "Charles made me sign it." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but Ethan knew he needed more. He reached out to the anonymous sender, who provided additional evidence: a series of emails and bank statements implicating the Everly Foundation in financial misconduct. The foundation, lauded for its charitable work, appeared to be a front for laundering money into offshore accounts. The evidence was damning, but Ethan wanted to be certain before taking any action. Late into the night, Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, surrounded by documents and photographs. His mind raced with questions. What had his mother been forced to sign? How much of her suffering had been tied to Charles's ambition? And why had the anonymous source chosen to involve him now, years after her death? As anger and determination surged within him, Ethan resolved to confront his father, even if it meant facing the man who had long since ceased to care about him. The weight of the past pressed heavily on Ethan's shoulders as he prepared for what lay ahead. This was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was about finding justice for his mother and reclaiming the truth that had been buried beneath his father's lies. Ethan knew the road would be difficult, but he was ready to face it. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, one that burned brighter than his fear of Charles Everly. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of discovering something monumental. The cryptic messages and the fragments of evidence had stirred something deep within him, a need for answers that had lain dormant for years. He couldn't stop thinking about his mother's quiet despair, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, and the unspoken weight she carried until her final days. The question that haunted him now was why. The investigation quickly became all-consuming. Ethan spent hours sifting through the documents sent by the anonymous source. Each new piece of evidence painted a damning picture. Charitable donations that vanished into shell companies, fake invoices, and offshore accounts linked to the Everly Foundation. The deeper Ethan looked, the clearer it became that the pristine image of the Everly name was built on a foundation of lies. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about his mother. He felt her presence in every quiet moment of his search, as though she were urging him to keep going. Her journals had been cryptic, but there was something unmistakably vulnerable in her words. "Charles made me sign it," she had written in one entry. Another read, "I trusted him once. I won't make that mistake again." The meaning was maddeningly elusive, but it was clear that whatever had happened to her wasn't an accident. She had been betrayed. Ethan's frustration grew as he realized how little he truly knew about his parents' marriage. His mother had never confided in him about the details, perhaps out of a desire to shield him, or perhaps because she believed he was too young to understand. But now, looking back, Ethan began to see the cracks in the facade. The tension in the air whenever Charles walked into a room, the way Eleanor's laughter would fade when Charles spoke, the hollow look in her eyes on the nights she thought no one was watching. Driven by these memories, Ethan began to reach out to people who might have answers. He called old family friends, former employees, anyone who might be willing to talk. Most were reluctant. Loyalty to Charles or fear of his power kept their lips sealed. But one voice broke through the silence, a former accountant for the Everly Foundation. The man, now retired and living a quiet life in another state, was hesitant at first. Ethan had to assure him repeatedly that this wasn't about revenge, but about uncovering the truth. Finally, the man spoke. He confirmed Ethan's suspicions. Funds had been redirected from the foundation to accounts under Charles's control. The accountant hadn't known the full extent of it, but he had seen enough to know it wasn't legal. He had resigned shortly after raising concerns, unwilling to be complicit. Hearing this, Ethan felt a mix of vindication and fury. His father's betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. The foundation that Charles had used to shape his public image, the one his mother had worked tirelessly to support, had been a sham. Worse, it seemed Eleanor had known, or at least suspected, and had been powerless to stop it. Ethan found himself in a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at his father for the lies, sadness for his mother, who had suffered in silence, and guilt, wondering if he could have done more for her when she was alive. The guilt was the hardest to bear, gnawing at him as he pieced together more of the puzzle. He kept returning to her journals, searching for clues he might have missed. He read and reread her words until they were etched into his mind. Amid his growing determination, doubts crept in. What if no one believed him? What if his father's power and influence drowned out the truth? Charles Everly was untouchable in the eyes of the world. A philanthropist, a genius, a self-made man. Ethan was just the estranged son, the black sheep who had walked away from the family years ago. Who would listen to him? Yet, the more he thought about his mother, the more his resolve hardened. This wasn't about public opinion or personal vindication. It was about justice. If there was even a chance to expose Charles and honor Eleanor's memory, Ethan had to try. As the evidence mounted, so did Ethan's anger. He could no longer contain the storm brewing inside him. He thought about the countless lives his father had touched under false pretenses, the lies that had propped up the Everly empire. Most of all, he thought about the woman who had given everything, only to be discarded like a pawn in Charles's game. The more Ethan uncovered, the clearer it became that his mother's legacy had been buried under the weight of Charles's ambition. She had deserved so much more. The truth was no longer just something Ethan wanted to find. It was something he owed her. Ethan stood outside the gleaming glass skyscraper that housed Everly Enterprises, his palms slick with sweat. The city buzzed around him, indifferent to the storm raging inside his chest. He hadn't set foot in his father's world for years, but today there was no turning back. Clutching a folder filled with incriminating evidence, he stepped through the revolving doors, his determination bolstered by a simmering anger that refused to be silenced. The lobby was as imposing as he remembered. Marble floors, sleek modern art, and the subtle scent of power that seemed to linger in the air. The receptionist looked up with a practiced smile, her expression faltering for a fraction of a second when she recognized him. Ethan could almost hear the unspoken question in her eyes. "What is he doing here?" "I need to see Charles," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension in his jaw. The receptionist hesitated. "Mr. Everly is in a meeting. He'll want to see me," Ethan interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. "Tell him it's urgent. Family business." After a moment's pause, she nodded and made the call. Ethan's heart pounded as he waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, she gestured toward the elevator. "He'll see you. Conference room 12. Ethan's fists clenched as he rode the elevator up, the folder tucked under his arm like a weapon. When the doors opened, he was greeted by a familiar sight. The sprawling conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And there, at the head of the table, was Charles Everly, every inch the commanding presence Ethan had grown to resent. Charles didn't bother to rise from his chair. His sharp, calculating eyes met Ethan's, and a faint smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "Ethan," he said, his voice dripping with mock warmth. What an unexpected surprise. Ethan dropped the folder onto the table with a thud, the papers spilling out like a cascade of accusations. "I'm not here for pleasantries," he said, his tone cold. "I'm here for answers." Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "And what, exactly, am I supposed to answer for?" Ethan's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "For lying to the world. For using the Everly Foundation to line your pockets. For betraying Mom." The mention of Eleanor seemed to flicker across Charles's face, but it was gone before Ethan could be sure. Instead, his father's smirk deepened, a mask of condescension that only fueled Ethan's anger. "Betraying your mother?" Charles repeated, feigning disbelief. "Ethan, you've always had a flair for the dramatic. What exactly are you accusing me of?" Ethan stepped closer, his voice trembling with emotion. "I know about the offshore accounts, the stolen funds. I know you forced Mom to sign away her inheritance, leaving her with nothing. She trusted you, and you used her like a pawn. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." Charles sighed, as if he were dealing with a particularly tiresome employee. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said dismissively. "You've pieced together a few scraps of information and convinced yourself you've uncovered some grand conspiracy. But the truth, Ethan, is that you're grasping at straws." Ethan slammed his hands onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Don't patronize me. I have proof. Emails, bank statements, testimonies. You can't hide behind your lies anymore." Charles's gaze hardened, his tone icy. "You have nothing. A few unverified documents and hearsay won't hold up against my reputation. You think you can waltz in here after years of estrangement and accuse me of corruption? You're wasting my time. And yours." Ethan's resolve wavered for a moment, but he pushed forward, his voice steady. "This isn't just about the money. It's about Mom. She deserved better than what you gave her. She deserved a husband, not a manipulator." Charles's expression darkened, his facade of calm cracking. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your mother knew the sacrifices that came with this family. She understood the cost of success. If she struggled, it was because she wasn't strong enough to handle it." The words hit Ethan like a blow, the callousness of them slicing through his anger and leaving only raw pain. He stared at his father, struggling to reconcile the man in front of him with the memory of the father he had once idolized. "You're unbelievable," he said finally, his voice hollow. "You really don't care, do you? About her, about me, about anyone but yourself." Charles rose from his chair, towering over Ethan with an air of finality. "This conversation is over," he said coldly. "I suggest you take whatever evidence you think you have and leave. You won't win this fight, Ethan. You never could." Ethan's hands trembled as he gathered the scattered papers, his mind racing with frustration and defeat. As he turned to leave, Charles's voice stopped him. "Oh, and Ethan," he said, his tone sharp, "if you try to take this public, you'll regret it. Don't bite the hand that feeds you." Ethan didn't respond. He walked out of the conference room, his heart heavy, but his resolve unbroken. Charles might think he'd won, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan had come for answers and left with a deeper understanding of his father's ruthlessness. Now more than ever, he knew what he had to do. Ethan sat on the worn leather couch in his tiny apartment, the faint hum of city traffic filtering through the cracked window. The confrontation with his father had left him seething, the weight of Charles's arrogance pressing heavily on his chest. He hadn't slept much in days, his mind consumed with what to do next. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Charles's smug face, heard his dismissive tone. The thought of letting his father get away with everything was unbearable. Then, an unexpected lifeline appeared. As Ethan was sifting through another batch of evidence late one evening, an envelope slid under his door. He froze, staring at the crisp white rectangle on the floor, his pulse quickening. Rising slowly, he approached it, half expecting some kind of trap. But when he opened it, the contents made his breath hitch. Inside was a gold-embossed invitation to the annual Evely Foundation Gala. It was an event Ethan had attended as a child, trailing behind his mother in a suit that always felt too big. He remembered the extravagance, the chandeliers that seemed to touch the sky, the laughter of people who had everything, and the way his mother's smile had seemed dimmer under the dazzling lights. This time, however, the invitation wasn't a relic of childhood nostalgia. It was an opportunity. Ethan sat back down, staring at the invitation as if it might vanish. The gala was Charles's crowning moment each year, a chance to bask in the glow of his public persona. Philanthropists, politicians, celebrities, they all came to pay homage to the man they believed was a savior of the less fortunate. If there was ever a moment to strike, to pull back the curtain on Charles's facade, it was this. But the enormity of the task loomed over him. How could he stand in front of those people and expose the truth? Would they even believe him? The doubts began to creep in, but then he thought of his mother. Her journals, her strained laughter, the years she had endured under Charles's control. She hadn't had the power to stand up to him, but Ethan did. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Ethan dove deeper into the evidence, determined to make his case airtight. He pored over bank statements, emails, and the testimonies he had managed to gather. Every time he hit a wall, he thought of his father's smug dismissal during their confrontation, the way he had brushed off Ethan's accusations as if they were nothing. That memory alone fueled him. The anonymous source who had first contacted him became an unexpected ally. Through encrypted messages, they provided more detailed information. Names of people involved in the money laundering, specific accounts where funds had been hidden. Ethan didn't know who this person was or why they were helping him, but he was grateful for the lifeline. As the gala approached, Ethan began to feel the weight of what he was about to do. It wasn't just about exposing Charles anymore. It was about stepping into a world he had spent years avoiding. He would be walking into a room full of people who saw him as a failure, the wayward son of a great man. But as he stood in front of his mirror on the night of the gala, adjusting the tie he hadn't worn in years, he told himself it didn't matter. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there to tell the truth. The night of the gala was unseasonably warm, the air heavy with anticipation. As Ethan approached the Grand Hotel where the event was being held, he felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with unease. The valet looked at him curiously as he handed over the invitation, his face betraying a flicker of recognition. "Mr. Evely," the valet said cautiously. "Welcome." Ethan nodded curtly, stepping into the grand lobby. The sound of soft classical music drifted through the air, mingling with the chatter of the elite. Everything was just as he remembered, elegant, extravagant, and hollow. He could see the glint of champagne glasses under the crystal chandeliers, the dazzling gowns, and tailored suits of people who lived in a world far removed from his own. He kept his head down as he moved through the crowd, avoiding the curious gazes and whispered speculations. A few people gave him polite nods, their eyes flickering with recognition. He caught snippets of conversation, mentions of stock markets, vacation homes, the latest charitable initiatives. It was all so disconnected from reality, so distant from the struggles of the people his father claimed to help. And then he saw him. Charles stood at the center of the room, surrounded by admirers. He looked every inch the magnate Ethan had grown to despise. Confident, composed, untouchable. He was laughing at something one of his guests had said, a glass of champagne in his hand, as if he didn't have a care in the world. For a moment, Ethan's resolve wavered. He felt like a child again, small and insignificant under the weight of his father's presence. But then he remembered why he was there. This wasn't about Charles's power or reputation. It was about the truth, about his mother, about justice. Ethan took a deep breath and began to weave his way through the crowd, the folder of evidence tucked securely under his arm. The noise of the gala seemed to fade as his heart pounded in his chest. Each step brought him closer to the man who had taken so much, to the moment that would change everything. This time, Ethan wasn't going to be silenced. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the ballroom glowed with an opulence that felt almost otherworldly. The massive crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm, golden light, reflecting off the polished marble floors and gilded mirrors that adorned the walls. A live string quartet played a gentle melody, their music weaving seamlessly into the hum of conversation and laughter. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd with practiced grace, offering trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The guests, clad in couture gowns and tailored tuxedos, radiated a confidence that only extreme wealth could bring. Ethan lingered near the edge of the room, deliberately staying out of the spotlight. His heart pounded against his ribs as he scanned the crowd, his mind racing with the weight of what he was about to do. The folder under his arm felt heavier with each passing second, its contents a ticking time bomb that would detonate the carefully constructed illusion of the Everly family. Across the room, Charles Everly commanded attention as easily as breathing. He moved through the crowd with an ease that Ethan could never emulate, exchanging handshakes and brief, polished laughs. His tailored tuxedo fit him perfectly, the embodiment of power and prestige. Ethan watched as people gravitated toward him, their smiles wide and deferential. To them, Charles was a hero, a philanthropist, a visionary, a man to be admired. They didn't see the lies. They didn't see the cracks in his facade. The sight made Ethan's stomach churn. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. What if this was a mistake? What if no one believed him? But then he thought of his mother. He thought of her weary smile, the way she had struggled in silence while Charles thrived. This wasn't just about exposing Charles. It was about giving her the justice she never had. That thought anchored him, steadied his nerves. A voice crackled over the microphone, drawing Ethan's attention to the small stage at the front of the room. A man in a dark suit, a member of the foundation's board, had stepped up to introduce the night's keynote speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "It is my distinct honor to welcome the man of the hour, a man whose vision and generosity have changed countless lives. Please join me in celebrating the incomparable Charles Everly." The room erupted in applause as Charles ascended the stage, his face composed in a perfect blend of humility and pride. He took the microphone, his commanding presence silencing the crowd. "Thank you, everyone," he began, his deep voice resonating through the ballroom. "Your support means the world to me and to the countless people whose lives we've touched through the Everly Foundation. Tonight, we celebrate not just our achievements, but the spirit of giving that unites us all." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. The words sounded rehearsed, empty, like a performance crafted to manipulate. The crowd hung on Charles's every word, nodding along as if he were a prophet. Ethan glanced at the folder under his arm. The evidence was damning: bank statements, emails, testimonies. It was time to bring it all into the light. As Charles continued his speech, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. His heart thundered in his chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sea of well-dressed guests parted instinctively as he moved, their curious gazes falling on him. Whispers rippled through the room, the sound growing louder as more people noticed him. Charles faltered mid-sentence, his eyes locking on Ethan. For a brief moment, the mask slipped. Surprise, annoyance, and something resembling fear flickered across his face before he composed himself. "Ethan," he said, his voice carrying a forced warmth. "What a surprise. I didn't know you'd be joining us tonight." Ethan stopped a few feet from the stage, his voice steady but laced with anger. "I wasn't planning to, but I couldn't miss the chance to see you celebrate your success. It's quite the show." The tension in the room was palpable. All eyes were on them now, the guests frozen in stunned silence. Charles's smile tightened, his tone sharpening. "This isn't the time or place, Ethan. If you'd like to speak privately, we can." "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "We'll do this here, in front of everyone." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Ethan placed the folder on the nearest table and opened it, pulling out a stack of papers. "You all think Charles Everly is a hero," he said, his voice ringing out over the room. "But he's not. He's a liar and a fraud. The Everly Foundation, the charity you've all donated to, the one you're here to celebrate, it's nothing more than a front for his greed." Charles stepped down from the stage, his expression darkening. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Ethan ignored him, holding up the documents. "These are bank statements showing millions of dollars diverted to offshore accounts under his control. Donations meant to help people in need were stolen to fund his lifestyle." The crowd erupted into murmurs, the whispers growing louder as people craned their necks to see the papers. Charles tried to take control, his voice booming. "This is nonsense. My son has always had a flair for dramatics. He's bitter, trying to tarnish my reputation out of spite." Ethan refused to back down. "This isn't about spite. This is about the truth. And it's not just the money. He betrayed my mother, forced her to sign away her inheritance, and left her with nothing." The room fell in a stunned silence. Ethan could see the disbelief on people's faces, the way they struggled to reconcile the man they admired with the accusations being leveled against him. Charles's composure cracked further, his voice trembling with anger. "You don't know what you're saying. You're ruining everything. For yourself, for this family." Ethan took a step closer, his voice calm but resolute. "No, Charles. You ruined it. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth." The murmurs in the room grew louder, and Ethan knew there was no turning back now. The walls of Charles Everly's carefully constructed empire were beginning to crumble. The ballroom was charged with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself was pressing down on everyone present. Ethan stood in the center of the storm, papers clutched in his hands, his heart hammering as he delivered his accusations. The room, moments ago alive with laughter and camaraderie, had fallen into a stunned, disbelieving silence. All eyes were on him and Charles, the man whose carefully curated facade was beginning to crack. Ethan's voice, firm but edged with emotion, cut through the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. "You all revere him as a philanthropist, a man who's changed lives. But the truth is, Charles Everly has spent decades building his empire on deceit. He's not the savior you think he is. He's a fraud." Charles stood just a few feet away, his face a mask of tightly controlled rage. The flicker of unease in his eyes hadn't escaped Ethan's notice, and it gave him a sliver of confidence. For once, Charles wasn't the unshakable titan Ethan had always known. This time, he was vulnerable. "You think you can come in here and slander me in front of my guests?" Charles snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them as if to rally their loyalty. "This is nothing more than a bitter attempt to tarnish my name. My son has been estranged for years, and now he shows up throwing baseless accusations. It's laughable, but the tremor in Charles's voice betrayed him, and Ethan wasn't about to let the moment slip. He held up a document, the page shaking slightly in his grasp. "This is a record of a transaction made through the Everly Foundation. A six-figure donation that, instead of reaching the nonprofit it was meant for, was redirected to an offshore account in the Caymans. Care to explain, Charles? The murmurs intensified, spreading like wildfire through the crowd. Faces turned from Ethan to Charles and back again, expressions ranging from confusion to shock. A few guests leaned in closer, trying to catch a glimpse of the papers in Ethan's hands. Charles's jaw tightened, his polished veneer slipping. "You don't know what you're talking about," he hissed, stepping closer to Ethan. "You've misinterpreted something you don't understand. These things are complicated. Financial structures like the foundation." Ethan cut him off, his voice rising. "Don't insult my intelligence, Charles. I've spent weeks combing through these documents. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's fraud. And it's not just this one transaction. There are dozens more, all with the same pattern. Money meant for charity, stolen to line your pockets." The room erupted. Gasps and whispers filled the air, some guests stepping back as if physically distancing themselves from Charles would absolve them of their association with him. Ethan could see it in their eyes, the flickers of doubt, the seeds of disbelief taking root. But he wasn't finished. "And let's not forget my mother," Ethan said, his voice shaking now, not with fear but with raw emotion. He turned to the crowd, the weight of his grief spilling into his words. Eleanor Everly was the heart of this family. She gave everything she had to support Charles, to uphold the image of the Everly name. But behind closed doors, she was treated like nothing more than a pawn. Charles's face darkened, his voice booming as he tried to regain control. "Enough," he barked, his tone sharp enough to make a few guests flinch. "This is not the time or place for your theatrics, Ethan." But Ethan wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when the truth was finally out in the open. "You forced her to sign away her inheritance, Charles," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "You took everything from her, her independence, her security. You left her with nothing. And when she needed you most, you turned your back on her." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, the collective breath of dozens of people held as they waited for Charles's response. For a moment, the older man seemed to falter. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The confident, untouchable man Ethan had grown up fearing was gone, replaced by someone scrambling to maintain control. "I did what I had to do for this family," Charles finally said, his voice quieter but no less sharp. "You have no idea the pressures I've faced, the sacrifices I've made to protect what we've built." "Protect?" Ethan shot back, his voice incredulous. "You didn't protect anything. You destroyed it. And you destroyed her." The crowd began to shift, the tide turning against Charles as murmurs of outrage replaced whispers of disbelief. A few guests began to walk out, their faces tight with disapproval. Others stared at Charles, their expressions a mixture of shock and betrayal. Even the board members, who had stood loyally by his side moments ago, were beginning to edge away, their loyalty wavering. Ethan felt a strange mix of triumph and sadness as he watched the scene unfold. He had done what he came to do. He had exposed the truth. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like grief. Grief for his mother, for the years she had suffered in silence. Grief for the family he had always wished he'd had, but never did. Grief for the boy he used to be, who had once looked up at his father and seen a hero. As Charles turned away, his shoulders stiff with the effort of holding onto his pride, Ethan took a deep breath. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of relief. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The aftermath of the gala was swift and brutal, a storm of consequences that neither Ethan nor Charles could have fully anticipated. By the time Ethan left the ballroom, the whispers of scandal had already started to spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with posts and photos from the event, and by morning, headlines screamed with sensationalized accounts of the confrontation. Billionaire Charles Everly accused of fraud by his strange son, philanthropist or con man. Shocking allegations rocked the Everly Foundation. Ethan sat in his cramped apartment, scrolling through article after article. The details varied, but the central narrative was clear. Charles Everly's perfect image had been shattered. Ethan's accusations, backed by the evidence he had presented, had ignited a media frenzy. News outlets dissected every detail, from the financial records to the personal revelations about Eleanor Everly. Analysts speculated about the validity of the claims, while public opinion began to polarize. Some lauded Ethan as a hero, a whistleblower who had risked everything to expose corruption. Others saw him as a bitter son, a discontented outsider looking to tarnish his father's legacy out of spite. Ethan tried not to let the backlash affect him, but the venom in some of the comments stung. Ungrateful rich kid. If he cared so much about his mother, where was he all these years? Typical family drama blown out of proportion. Despite the noise, Ethan knew he had done the right thing. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. But the fallout extended far beyond the media circus. The Everly Foundation was the first to feel the blow. By midday, key donors began pulling their support, their carefully worded statements expressing concern over the recent allegations. Within days, the foundation's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Ethan didn't know what was said behind closed doors, but when the press release came out, it was clear they were scrambling to distance themselves from Charles. The Everly Foundation is committed to transparency and accountability, the statement read. We are cooperating fully with all inquiries and will take appropriate action to ensure the trust of our supporters is upheld. Ethan read the statement with a bitter laugh. Appropriate action, he thought. The words were vague, carefully designed to protect their interests while offering no real accountability. But the cracks in the foundation were undeniable. The authorities launched a preliminary investigation, and whispers of subpoenas and audits began circulating. For Charles, the fallout was even more personal. The guests who had once flocked to his side now avoided him. His social calendar emptied overnight. Invitations rescinded as acquaintances sought to avoid association with his tarnished name. Ethan knew his father well enough to imagine how much this isolation would sting. Charles thrived on power, on being the center of attention. To see that taken away must have been its own kind of punishment. But Ethan didn't revel in the consequences. There was no satisfaction in watching his father's world crumble, only a strange hollowness. He had spent so long hating Charles, building his life around the idea of exposing him, that now, with the truth out, he wasn't sure what came next. The fallout also brought unexpected moments of connection. Clara, his estranged sister, reached out for the first time in years. She called late one evening, her voice hesitant but genuine. "Ethan," she said after an awkward pause, "I saw the news. I don't know what to say." Ethan leaned against the wall, unsure how to respond. They had never been close, their relationship fractured by years of distance and misunderstandings. But there was something in her voice, a vulnerability that matched his own. "You don't have to say anything," he replied finally. "I didn't do this to hurt you." "I know," she said softly. I think Mom would have been proud of you." The words hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, he couldn't speak, the weight of her statement settling over him. "Thanks, Clara," he said eventually. "That means a lot." Their conversation was brief, but it felt like the first step toward rebuilding something that had been broken for years. Even as the fallout continued to ripple outward, Ethan found himself reflecting on the cost of what he had done. His relationship with his father, strained as it had always been, was now beyond repair. He doubted Charles would ever forgive him for exposing the truth, let alone admit to any wrongdoing. But as Ethan looked at the evidence, at the headlines, at the tentative connections he was beginning to rebuild with Clara, he realized he could live with that. The Everly name had been a symbol of power and prestige, but now it was something else, a story of downfall, of truth brought to light. Ethan didn't know what the future held for him or for his family, but for the first time, he felt like he could move forward without the weight of his father's lies holding him back. And that, he realized, was a victory in itself. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Clara Everly sat at the marble counter of her high-rise kitchen, staring at her untouched cup of coffee. The once soothing aroma of hazelnut felt overwhelming now, her stomach churning with a mix of anxiety and uncertainty. The news from the gala had spread like wildfire, and everywhere she turned, it was the same headline: Charles Everly exposed. Scandal erupts at Gala. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls from friends, colleagues, and reporters. She had ignored them all, unable to stomach the questions she knew they would ask. Clara had always known her father to be controlling, manipulative even. But this? The allegations Ethan had made didn't just tarnish their family name. They shattered it. And yet, as she sat there, the part that unsettled her most wasn't the public fallout. It was the question that had been haunting her since the moment she saw Ethan's accusations. What if he's right? Her mind raced with memories, fragments of moments she had buried long ago. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, and how fragile she had seemed in those final years. There were nights Clara had heard muffled arguments behind closed doors, the sharp edge in her father's voice cutting through the walls. She had never asked questions, choosing instead to believe the sanitized version of events her father had always presented. "Your mother is fine," he would say, dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. "She worries too much, that's all." But now, with Ethan's words echoing in her mind, Clara began to question everything. Had her mother suffered in silence all those years? Had Charles really forced her to sign away her inheritance, as Ethan claimed? The thought made Clara's chest tighten. She had always trusted her father, even when his actions seemed cold or calculated. But now, that trust felt misplaced like a house built on sand. Against her better judgment, she picked up her phone and scrolled through the news. There were clips from the gala, Ethan's voice rising over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. Clara tapped on one of the videos, her finger hesitating before pressing play. "Betrayed my mother, forced her to sign away her inheritance, and left her with nothing." Ethan's voice rang out, filled with a raw emotion that made Clara's heart ache. He didn't protect her. He destroyed her. Clara paused the video, her hands trembling. Ethan's pain was palpable, his anger cutting through the screen. She had barely spoken to her brother in years, their relationship strained by the same distance and coldness that had defined their family. But now, hearing his voice, she felt a pang of guilt. Had she been complicit in ignoring the truth? Had she allowed her father's version of reality to blind her to what was really happening? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, Clara glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for visitors. She crossed the room, her bare feet padding softly against the polished wood floors, and opened the door to find Ethan standing there. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, and his face etched with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. "Clara," Ethan said finally, his voice softer than she expected. "I didn't know where else to go." She stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "You've been busy," she said, her tone laced with a nervous humor that didn't quite land. "The whole world is talking about you." Ethan gave a hollow laugh as he set his bag down near the door. "Yeah, I noticed." They sat across from each other at the kitchen counter, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Clara studied her brother, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands fidgeted with the strap of his bag. He looked older somehow, as if the events of the past few days had aged him years. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About any of this?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Would you have believed me? You've always been closer to Dad. I figured you'd just take a side." Clara flinched at the words, though she knew there was truth in them. "I'm not. I don't know if I ever took a side, Ethan. She paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. It was easier to just ignore it." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. That's how he operates. He counts on people ignoring things, brushing them under the rug. That's how he's gotten away with it for so long. Clara felt a pang of guilt. She had always admired her father's strength, his ability to command a room, to bend the world to his will. But now, she saw those traits in a different light. They weren't signs of strength. They were tools of manipulation. "I want to know the truth," she said finally, her voice steady. "All of it, about Mom, about the foundation, everything." Ethan's eyes searched hers, and for the first time in years, Clara felt a connection between them that hadn't been there before. A shared determination to uncover what had been hidden for so long. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the counter. "It's all in here," he said. "It's ugly, Clara, but you deserve to know." She opened the folder, her heart pounding as she began to read. The more she saw, the more the reality of her father's actions came into focus. By the time she closed the folder, her hands were trembling, her mind reeling from the weight of the revelations. "Mom," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "She didn't deserve any of this." "No," Ethan agreed quietly. "She didn't." Clara wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath as she steadied herself. "What do we do now?" Ethan looked at her, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "We make it right, together." For the first time in years, Clara felt a sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let her father's lies define their family any longer. The tension in the Everly family had always simmered beneath the surface, hidden by the gleaming facade of wealth and prestige. But now, with Ethan's accusations lighting a match to the carefully constructed illusion, the cracks in their foundation began to widen into irreparable rifts. Clara sat in her car outside the Everly estate, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She hadn't been back here in months, maybe longer. The towering gates loomed ahead, as imposing as ever, a physical reminder of her father's dominance over their lives. She hesitated before buzzing the intercom, unsure of what to expect inside. The warmth of her conversation with Ethan still lingered, but it was now joined by a knot of apprehension. Her father wouldn't take her involvement lightly. When the gates finally opened, Clara drove up the long, winding driveway, her pulse quickening. The house came into view, its grandeur unchanged despite the turmoil swirling around its inhabitants. She parked and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath her heels the only sound in the still air. As she walked to the door, she steeled herself for what was to come. The butler greeted her with a polite nod, but even he seemed subdued, his usual confidence replaced with a hint of unease. Clara entered the grand foyer, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filling her senses. Her father's voice echoed from the study, sharp and angry, as if he were already locked in an argument. "Clara," Charles said when she entered, his tone clipped but controlled. He stood behind his desk, hands resting on its edge, his imposing figure framed by the large window behind him. "I wasn't expecting you." Clara crossed her arms, meeting his gaze with a defiance she hadn't felt before. "I figured we needed to talk." Charles gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. He sighed, sinking into his leather chair. "I assume this is about your brother's little performance at the gala." Clara's stomach twisted at his words. "It wasn't a performance," she said, her voice steady. "He had evidence, Dad. Real evidence." Charles leaned forward, his expression darkening. "And you believed him? After all the years he spent away from this family, you're going to take his side?" "This isn't about sides," Clara snapped, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "This is about the truth. About what you did to Mom. About the foundation. I've seen the documents, Dad. I know what you've been hiding." For the first time, Charles faltered. His face tightened, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. But he recovered quickly, his voice taking on that same tone of authority that had always made her second-guess herself. "Your mother didn't understand the decisions I had to make. She was emotional, impulsive. Everything I did was for this family, for you, for Ethan." Clara's chest tightened. "Don't you dare try to justify this as something you did for us. Mom suffered because of you. Ethan suffered. And now, you're trying to make me feel guilty for questioning you." Charles rose to his feet, his voice booming. "You don't know what it takes to build an empire like this. The sacrifices, the compromises. I did what was necessary to protect everything we had." "Protect?" Clara's voice cracked as she took a step closer. "You destroyed our family for your ambition. You used Mom, and when she wasn't useful anymore, you discarded her. And Ethan? You drove him away because he refused to fall in line. Do you even hear yourself?" Charles's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Clara felt the tears welling in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of thinking she was weak. "I wanted to believe you were the man everyone else sees," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. The visionary, the philanthropist. But you're not. You're just a man who couldn't see beyond his own ego. For a moment, the silence between them was deafening. Clara thought she saw a flicker of something in her father's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or shame, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. When he spoke again, his tone was cold, devoid of the warmth she had once clung to. "If you want to throw away everything I've built, then go ahead," Charles said. "But don't come crawling back when you realize how unforgiving the world is without me." Clara stared at him, her heart aching with the realization that this man, her father, would never change. He had chosen his empire over his family long ago, and nothing she or Ethan said would make him see the truth. With a deep breath, she turned and walked out of the study, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her like a wave of relief. She climbed into her car and sat there for a moment, letting the tears she had held back finally fall. It wasn't just grief for the man her father had become. It was grief for the family they could have been. Clara pulled out her phone and dialed Ethan's number. He answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice cautious. She let out a shaky breath. "It didn't. He's never going to admit what he's done." Ethan was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry, Clara. I know how hard this is. She hesitated, wiping her eyes. "I needed to try, but I'm done pretending everything's fine. I'm with you, Ethan. Whatever it takes to fix this, I'm in." For the first time that day, Clara felt a sense of clarity. Her father's empire might have divided them, but she and Ethan were finally on the same side. Together, they would confront the wreckage he had left behind and rebuild something better, something honest. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. The legal storm began almost immediately after Ethan's revelations at the gala. Within days, subpoenas were issued, and investigators descended upon the Everly Foundation headquarters like a swarm. The media, ever eager for drama, camped outside the office and the Everly estate, documenting every twist and turn of the unfolding scandal. Ethan sat at a cafe downtown, scrolling through the endless coverage on his phone. His coffee sat untouched on the table, his appetite non-existent. The evidence he had handed over to the authorities was solid, but the weight of the legal machine, now grinding in emotion, was far heavier than he'd imagined. He had expected backlash, but not the all-consuming spectacle this had become. The door jingled as Clara entered, spotting him in the corner. She moved quickly to his table, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. She slid into the seat across from him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "They're going after the foundation hard," she said without preamble. "It's all over the news. The board's in chaos, and Dad's scrambling to contain it." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "It's not just the foundation. The investigators are looking into everything. Every company, every account. This isn't just about what I found. They're pulling at every thread." Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you think he'll actually face charges?" Ethan looked at her, the weight of the question hanging between them. "I don't know," he admitted. "Dad's not the kind of man who leaves a paper trail unless he's absolutely certain it can't be traced back to him. But with this much scrutiny, something's bound to stick." The cafe buzzed with quiet conversation around them, but Clara and Ethan felt like they were in their own world, navigating the fallout of a battle they hadn't expected to be so vast. Clara took a deep breath, fiddling with the ring on her finger. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He thought about the sleepless nights, the endless stream of reporters shouting his name, the tension of knowing he had torn apart his family's legacy. But he also thought about his mother, her quiet strength, her hidden pain, the way she had endured so much for so long without justice. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. It had to be done." The legal proceedings quickly became a spectacle in their own right. Charles was subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury, a moment that dominated every news cycle. The sight of him walking into the courthouse, flanked by his high-powered legal team, was surreal. The once imposing titan of industry now looked smaller, his usual confidence replaced with a grim determination. Inside the courtroom, The atmosphere was tense. Ethan attended the hearings, his stomach twisting as he watched the proceedings unfold. Clara sat beside him, her hand occasionally brushing against his in silent solidarity. The prosecutor presented the evidence Ethan had uncovered: bank statements, emails, and testimonies from former employees who had finally come forward. Each piece was another brick in the case being built against Charles. Ethan couldn't help but glance at his father throughout the trial. Charles sat stoically, his face an unreadable mask. There were moments when he looked at Ethan, their eyes meeting briefly, but whatever passed between them was too fleeting to interpret. The defense team, as expected, came prepared. They argued that the transactions were part of standard financial practices, twisting the evidence to sow doubt. They painted Charles as a man targeted by his own son out of bitterness, a narrative the tabloids eagerly latched onto. A family feud, one headline read, "Or a billionaire's fall?" The case dragged on for weeks, each day revealing more of the rot that had festered beneath the surface of the Everly empire. Former employees testified about being silenced when they raised concerns about money being moved in ways that didn't align with the foundation's mission. One of the most damning testimonies came from a former accountant who detailed how funds had been funneled to offshore accounts. The courtroom fell silent as the witness described the pressure he had faced to stay quiet, the subtle threats that had kept him compliant for years. Clara leaned toward Ethan during the testimony, her voice barely audible. "How do we not see it?" she whispered. "How did we not know?" Ethan shook his head, his jaw tight. "We didn't want to see it," he said. "That's what Dad's always counted on." As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the evidence became undeniable. Charles's defense team worked tirelessly, but the cracks in their arguments were too large to ignore. The prosecutors delivered a closing statement that cut to the heart of the matter. This case isn't just about money. It's about trust. The trust of donors, employees, and a family betrayed by one man's greed. The jury deliberated for 2 tense days before delivering their verdict. Ethan and Clara sat in the packed courtroom, their hearts pounding as the foreperson stood to speak. We find the defendant, Charles Everly, guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The words hung in the air, a mix of relief and devastation washing over Ethan. Clara gripped his hand tightly, her nails digging into his skin. The reporters outside erupted into a frenzy as the news broke, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Charles was led away, his face pale but composed. As he passed Ethan, he paused for the briefest of moments, his eyes meeting his son's. There was no anger in his gaze, no plea for forgiveness, just a hollow resignation that Ethan had never seen before. And then he was gone, swallowed by the machinery of justice. Outside the courthouse, Ethan and Clara stood side by side, the crowd of reporters shouting questions they didn't answer. For the first time in weeks, the weight on Ethan's chest felt a little lighter. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. Clara turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "We did the right thing," she said, her voice steady, "even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did. For Mom. For the people he hurt. It's over now." But as they walked away from the courthouse, Ethan knew that the end of the trial was just the beginning of a new chapter. One where they would have to rebuild from the ashes of their father's empire, piece by piece, together. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the rain fell in a steady rhythm as Ethan parked his car outside the Everly estate for what he knew would be the last time. The house loomed ahead, its grandeur diminished by the shadows cast by the storm and the recent events that had torn its foundations apart. For decades, it had been a symbol of power, wealth, and control. Now it felt hollow, a mausoleum for a legacy built on lies. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped out into the rain, the cold droplets soaking through his jacket as he approached the door. He had debated coming here for days, unsure of what he would say, or even why he felt compelled to confront his father one last time. Part of him wanted closure. Another part needed to see Charles stripped of his defenses, without the power and prestige he had used as shields for so long. The butler answered the door, his expression weary but professional. "He's in the study," he said simply, stepping aside to let Ethan in. The house was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. Ethan's footsteps echoed as he made his way down the familiar hallways, each step bringing back memories he had tried to bury. Childhood Christmases, family dinners, arguments that had echoed through these very walls. He found Charles seated in the study, his back to the door as he stared out the rain-streaked window. The once commanding figure looked smaller now, his posture hunched and his tailored suit slightly disheveled. Papers were scattered across the desk, and an untouched glass of scotch sat within arm's reach. The sight was almost jarring. This was not the man Ethan had spent his life fearing and resenting. This was a man who had lost everything. Charles turned slowly at the sound of Ethan's approach. His expression was unreadable, a mix of defiance and exhaustion. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice quieter than Ethan remembered, stripped of the commanding tone that had always made him feel small. Ethan stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "I wasn't sure I'd come," he admitted, "but I needed to say a few things." Charles gestured vaguely toward a chair, but Ethan remained standing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the sound of the rain filling the silence. Finally, Ethan broke the tension. "You always said you did everything for the family," he began, his voice steady. "But you never asked what we needed. Mom didn't need money or status. She needed someone to stand by her, to treat her with respect. And you failed her." Charles flinched, the words hitting their mark. "You think I didn't love your mother?" he said, his tone defensive. "I gave her everything she could have wanted. This house, security, a life most people only dream of." Ethan shook his head, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You gave her things, Dad. That's not the same as love. She wanted a partner, not someone who used her as a pawn in his games. She deserved better than what you gave her, and deep down, you know that." Charles's gaze dropped to the desk, his hands gripping the edge tightly. For the first time, he looked human, vulnerable. "You don't understand," he said after a long pause. "The pressure I was under, the sacrifices I had to make to keep this family together. It was never about greed. It was about survival." "Survival?" Ethan's voice rose, incredulous. "We were never in danger, Dad. The only thing you were trying to protect was your ego. You sacrificed everything. Mom, your integrity, your relationship with me and Clara. For what? A legacy that's crumbled around you?" Charles's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might lash out. But then his shoulders sagged, and the fight seemed to drain from him. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "I thought if I built something big enough, strong enough, it would make up for everything else." Ethan's anger wavered, replaced by a pang of sadness. This man, who had spent his life chasing power, was now left with nothing but regrets. But even now, Charles couldn't fully admit his mistakes. "You didn't build anything worth keeping," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "All you did was destroy the people who cared about you." Charles looked up at him, his eyes searching Ethan's face for something. Understanding, forgiveness, maybe even absolution. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You've taken everything. My reputation, my empire. What else is there?" Ethan took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "You did this to yourself," he said evenly. "I didn't want to take anything from you. I wanted you to take responsibility, to face what you've done, but I see now that's never going to happen." Charles looked away, his shoulders slumping further. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. Ethan realized then that this was the closest his father would ever come to an apology, and it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "I didn't come here to hurt you," Ethan said finally. "I came here because I needed to let go of the anger. I've spent my whole life trying to live in your shadow, to fight against everything you represent. But I'm done with that. I'm done with you." Charles's head snapped up, a flicker of something, panic perhaps, crossing his face. But Ethan didn't give him a chance to respond. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps firm and unyielding. As he reached the threshold, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "You have nothing left to hide behind now," he said. "Maybe it's time you figure out who you really are. But that's not my problem anymore." And with that, Ethan walked out, leaving the man who had cast such a long shadow over his life to sit alone in the house that had once symbolized everything he thought he wanted. The rain continued to fall as Ethan stepped outside, the cool droplets washing over him like a cleansing wave. For the first time in years, he felt free. It wasn't the closure he had hoped for, but it was enough. Ethan stood at the edge of the small stage, his palms damp as he looked out over the gathering crowd. The room was modest, far from the grandeur of the Everly Foundation galas he had grown up attending, but it felt more alive, more real. The faces in the audience weren't those of celebrities or power brokers, but of community leaders, volunteers, and people who had come to support a cause born from pain, perseverance, and the determination to create something meaningful. Beside him, Clara adjusted the microphone stand, glancing his way with an encouraging smile. It had been months since their father's trial, and though the wounds left behind by the fallout were still fresh, they had both found a renewed sense of purpose in the aftermath. The scandal had marked the end of the Everly name as they had known it, but for Ethan and Clara, it was also an opportunity, a chance to rebuild something better. The two of them had spent countless late nights brainstorming, planning, and pouring their energy into what they had dubbed the Eleanor Initiative. Named in honor of their mother, the organization's mission was simple yet profound: to provide resources and support for those exploited by systems of power. It was their way of reclaiming their family's legacy, of turning something built on lies into a force for truth and justice. The inaugural event was their first big step, a gathering to announce the initiative's launch and its first projects. Ethan's nerves were on edge, but when he looked out at the crowd, he saw a sea of supportive faces, their presence a reminder of why he was doing this. Clara stepped up to the microphone first, her voice steady and confident. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her tone warm and genuine. "For many of you, the name Everly probably carries mixed emotions. It's a name tied to scandal, betrayal, and loss. But today, we're here to start something new, to redefine what that name stands for." The audience applauded, and Ethan felt a swell of pride. Clara had found her footing in a way he hadn't fully expected. She had always been poised, but in the months since the trial, she had become a true partner in their mission, channeling her pain into action. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "For a long time, I didn't know what my purpose was," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I spent years running from my family's legacy, trying to distance myself from everything it represented. But when I started uncovering the truth, I realized I couldn't run anymore. I had to face it." He paused, scanning the room. "This initiative isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it. It's about honoring the people who were hurt along the way, including my mother, Eleanor, who was the heart of our family and the inspiration for everything we're doing here. She taught me that compassion and integrity mean more than power or wealth ever could." The applause that followed was genuine, and Ethan felt a weight lift off his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't speaking from a place of anger or resentment. He was speaking from a place of hope. After the speeches, the event shifted into a reception. Ethan moved through the crowd with Clara, meeting attendees and listening to their stories. Many had been affected by the systems of exploitation their father had used to amass his wealth, while others had come to support the siblings' efforts to make amends. Ethan found himself humbled by the resilience and determination of the people he met. As the evening wore on, Clara pulled him aside, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. She handed him one with a small smile. "You did good up there," she said. "So did you," Ethan replied, clinking his glass against hers. "I couldn't have done this without you." Clara's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes growing serious. "You know, I used to think Dad was invincible," she admitted. "That no matter what happened, he'd always come out on top. But now, I see that power without purpose is meaningless. What we're doing here, this is what matters." Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting to the crowd around them. He chose his legacy over his family. But we don't have to make the same choice. We can build something real, something that actually helps people, The two of them stood in silence for a moment, watching as attendees mingled, exchanged ideas, and connected over the shared vision of the Eleanor Initiative. The room was filled with a sense of possibility, of hope for a better future. As the event wound down, Ethan found himself standing by the stage, looking out at the room one last time. The journey here had been long and painful, filled with moments of doubt and heartbreak. But standing there, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The weight of his father's legacy no longer felt suffocating. It was still there, a shadow in the background, but it no longer defined him. He had chosen a different path, one that honored his mother's memory, rebuilt his bond with Clara, and allowed him to create something meaningful out of the wreckage. As the last guest began to leave, Clara joined him by the stage, her expression mirroring his. "Think Mom would be proud?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling at the thought. "Yeah," he said, his voice soft but certain. "I think she would." Together, they turned off the lights and stepped out into the night, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in years, the future felt like theirs to shape. And this time, they would get it right. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.